reserve.
Can everyone take their seats? We're going to try to get started, and hopefully we'll be let the late people drift in. So, welcome to our session on preventing genocide in the 21st century. My name is Mike Abramowitz, and I direct our new center on the prevention of genocide. The subject that we're going to talk about today is a very important subject, and one that has been at the really part of the museum's mission since we opened in 1993, 20 years ago. Dr. Wiesel often has said that he wanted our museum to be a living memorial, and has talked about how a memorial unresponsive to the future would violate the memory of the past. And that really animated the creation of our Committee on Conscience, which still exists and is chaired by Michael Chertoff. And it also animates the work of our Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which tries to carry out the mandate of the Committee on Conscience by doing public education and outreach to policymakers to try to really focus the world's attention on the ongoing threats of genocide in our time. I'm incredibly thrilled and honored that we have present with us today Antony Blinken. A full disclosure, Tony is a very dear personal friend of mine, and he's someone who is widely respected among his peers for his deep commitment to public service. Tony is now at the White House as a Deputy National Security Advisor, and you've seen in his resume, which should be in your packets, his very, very impressive professional resume. I think for our purposes, one of the important things that he has been working on that we're going to talk about today is the work of the new Atrocities Prevention Board and the commitment of the Obama administration to try to prevent atrocities. I also think it's relevant that Tony also has a very strong personal commitment to issues of Holocaust memory that probably, for a variety of reasons, also stems from the fact that his stepfather is a very prominent Holocaust survivor. Samuel Pisar survived Auschwitz and became a very distinguished French jurist after that. So I thought that we might just start our talk today. Before I give Tony an opportunity, we're going to hear a lot more from Tony. I want to show you a video clip we have of one of our survivor volunteers this is Nessie, who survived Auschwitz, and she talked a little bit about the connection, her own connection to the story of current day genocide. Dana, do we have that video to show?
Although I was informed and I knew what was happening in Darfur, but that woman standing there and saying in her broken English how she succeeded to escape that, how she came here. And you know, I thought to myself, it sounds like me years ago. How did I survive? Because I know what it is to be orphaned and homeless, not to have anything left, just hope, just hope. And the world was silent while we were suffering. And I said, we cannot be silent again. And I turned to the young woman that was standing there, and I said, yes, we are going to stand, I personally are going to stand with you, shoulder to shoulder, and not allow the world to be silent.
So Tony, that video is a very powerful call for our action here. First of all, welcome, and I just wondered if you might just give you an opportunity to make some opening remarks, but maybe you can talk a little bit about your own personal associations with the Holocaust and how it continues to inspire the work that you do.
Michael, thank you. It's very good to be with a close friend. It's especially good to be with all of you and to be here at this remarkable institution. As Michael said, it has a particular resonance for me, and I imagine there's some survivors among us today. I salute all of you. It has a resonance for a number of reasons. So many of us as Americans have our own stories, our own narratives that tie back to that time. and to other difficult times that brought us or brought our forebears to the United States. My grandfather, my father's father, fled pogroms in Russia at the turn of the last century. My stepmother fled communism in Hungary after the Second World War. And as Mike mentioned, my stepfather is a survivor. And I grew up in part with him and heard the stories, heard the experience. He's from Białystok, Poland. There were 900 children in his school, and to our knowledge, he's the only survivor of that school. But the reason I felt that it was important to be here is because this is a living institution. And it's a living institution in two ways. It's a living institution because those who perished have a life thanks to everything that the museum does. They're still with us, they're present, they animate us. But it's also a living institution because of the work that Michael and his colleagues do in terms of atrocity prevention. Taking the story, the history, the remembrance, and turning it into a tool not only to remember the past so that we don't forget it, but to do something about the present. And that's why it's so vital, and that's why I applaud what you and your colleagues are doing. And so it's good to be here.
Thank you, Tony. Now I'm going to show one more clip. That's going to be it for clips, but I think it will help frame the conversation. A year ago, the President of the United States came to our museum, almost exactly a year ago, to announce what we think was a very important new initiative to really make genocide and atrocity prevention much more of a central part of the U.S. policymaking. I'm proud to say, it's really one of the proudest things I think the museum has done, that a number of the key recommendations were drawn from the Genocide Prevention Task Force, which we sponsored. So I thought we should just listen to the President a little bit before we have a conversation about it.
It's a bitter truth. Too often the world has failed to prevent the killing of innocents on a massive scale, and we are haunted by the atrocities that we did not stop and the lives we did not save. 3 years ago today, I joined many of you for a ceremony of remembrance at the U.S. Capitol, and I said that we had to do everything we can to prevent and end atrocities. And so I want to report back to some of you today to let you know that as President I've done my utmost to back up those words with deeds. Last year, in the first ever presidential directive on this challenge, I made it clear that preventing mass atrocities and genocide is a core national security interest and a core moral responsibility of the United States of America.
All right, those are very powerful words from the President, saying it's a core national security interest of the United States. Can you, Tony, give us a little bit of a report card of what's happened in the last year and tell us a little bit about the reforms and what you've done and how you think they're working?
I think the first very important thing to say is that if the President is the father of this initiative, the patron saint of it is actually in this room, and that's Samantha Power. No one has done more than Samantha to bring the vision the President articulated to life. She recently left government, hopefully not for long, but in her time, this is one of her many extraordinary achievements. And let me talk a little bit about what we've been trying to do, and I want to emphasize this is really a work in progress. So the President asked us a year or so ago to spend 100 days looking at how the government is organized or not organized to prevent atrocities. And we were inspired by work that was sponsored by this institution, a Genocide Prevention Task Force chaired by Madeleine Albright and Bill Cohen did extraordinary work that helped animate our own thinking and gave us a lot of very, very good ideas upon which we acted. And so we had that work. We did an internal review to look at how we were organized, and we came up with some initiatives to try and make real what the President talked about. And there are a number of things that we've done, the most important of which is the creation of the Atrocities Prevention Board. When you don't work in government, it's sometimes hard to fathom why organization and process is almost as important as what you actually do. But it makes a huge difference, because governance, like many other things in life, is about priorities. You have to make something a priority in order to make sure the resources are dedicated to it, the time and energy is dedicated to it, the focus is dedicated to it. And what the Atrocities Prevention Board does, and Samantha was the chair of this board, is it brings together senior people across our government. And it does two things. It tries to look out on the horizon and see emerging risks and challenges, potential atrocities in the making, to identify them before they happen. And then it works across government to develop new tools to do something about it, not just to react after the fact, but ideally to prevent before the fact. And this has had a powerful impact already on the way we do business, because it also, in doing this work, forces senior officials throughout government to be responsive. The board will bring to others in government problems they've identified, ideas for dealing with them, and then we have to confront them. So this has been a major innovation in the way government works. It's still in its infancy. We're still developing it as a tool, but it's already made a difference every day. We've worked also very hard on early warning. We brought in the intelligence community in a way that it hadn't been brought in before, asking it to do, for the first time, something we call a national intelligence estimate, to look out and to try and predict where problems might emerge. Because if you don't catch these things before they start, once they've started, it is, for reasons we can get into, infinitely harder. And so we have a greater ability, thanks to marshaling the resources of our intelligence community, to look out and try and see something before it comes up and bites us. We've worked hard on a number of other things. We've been working on accountability and trying to make sure that those who would perpetrate atrocities know that they'll be held accountable. There's been increased cooperation, for example, with the International Criminal Court, again, something we may want to get into later. And we've worked very hard to build up the capacity of others, because we can't do this alone. And that means the United Nations, it means other countries, and it means even internally the capacity of our own government to deal with atrocity prevention. So all of this is a work in progress, but it really starts with what the President said, which is that he identified this as not just a moral imperative, but a national security priority. That's what makes the difference. It's all too easy in government to say, look, there are tons of problems out there. It would be great if we could do something about them, but we just can't, and it really doesn't go to our core interests. What the President said is atrocity prevention is a core interest. It's a national security interest, and that has helped focus the government on being more proactive and trying to get ahead of a problem, not fall behind it.
Thank you, Tony. I'd like to come to talk about some of the current cases that the board and the government are looking at, but I did want to ask about one historical case. We were chatting about a little bit in the green room beforehand, and we had President Clinton here. He gave a very moving talk this morning at our major tribute event. President Clinton, of course, has been very forthright in apologizing for what happened during the Rwandan genocide almost 20 years ago, where 800,000 mostly Tutsi were murdered in 3 months in Rwanda. As you think about the past, and you were at a much lower level in the Clinton administration, but have you thought about why the United States, along with the rest of the international community, was so paralyzed and unable to act during Rwanda?
So I think any of us who were in government in whatever capacity at that time are still scarred by that experience. It's something you have to live with, and it's a motivating factor, I think, in the way we look at problems today. And and we'll probably talk about this later. When you see a Syria, when you see a Congo, it's in a sense doubly painful, because we have that memory of having been in positions of responsibility when the Rwanda genocide happened. I think two things I'd say. One is, it's so much harder to be effective once something started than it is obviously before it started. Because when atrocities have already broken out, the decision space seems to be much more limited. It looks like your options are very narrow. You start to see the world as an almost binary choice between taking action, which often translates into military action, and doing nothing. And it's a very, very difficult position to find yourself in. So in thinking about it, my hope is that a Rwanda would actually be a little bit less likely to happen today for a couple of reasons. One, we are more focused on prevention than we were then. We are looking out and trying to scan the horizon to see things emerge before they become a full-blown atrocity. We have a better early warning mechanism than we did back in 1994. We also have better assets. I think the United Nations and peacekeeping have come a long way from where they were over a decade ago. And we've spent a lot of time and effort trying to build up that system. But you know, again, I think it comes back to something else. It comes back to identifying your priorities. I went back and I looked at what not only the government was doing and saying back in 94, but also what some of the major newspapers were writing. And in 94, the Washington Post wrote that Rwanda really didn't go to our national interests, and it didn't make sense to get involved. Precisely because the president has tried to refocus us, because he's tried to make atrocity prevention a core security interest, I think we look at these problems in a different way. Obviously, you can look out there and say, well, that's certainly not true across the board. We still have horrific problems in Sudan. We have Syria. We have Congo. But I'd like to think that we're working on those, not as effectively as we'd like to, but we are. And I think that, more to the point, we're more focused than we were in 94 in getting ahead of these problems.
Your point, Tony, about the prevention versus response, of how the options really narrow after atrocities or conflict begins, is very appreciated. But I do want to, those are the cases that really focus the mind, that focus government attention. And I think I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the case of Syria. So in the course of the 2-year civil war, I think these numbers are right. We've had about at least 70,000 civilian deaths. Many of those people have died, non-combatants, part of massacres, atrocities. We had last night at our dinner, we had the UN High Commissioner for Refugees who told me personally of just the incredible displacement that's going on. We have now some 2 million people displaced, either internally or refugees. And this is an atrocity that is happening in slow motion before our eyes. Why, in this case, do you think the international community is so paralyzed to act? And do you think, now we have reports that Assad may have used or did use chemical weapons, which makes it even more dangerous. What are your thoughts about, number one, why it's been so difficult for the world to act in a preventive way when everyone agrees, as you say, that prevention would be better? And then number two, what might be some concrete steps forward?
So let's talk about Syria, but just before we do, I do want to point to a couple of instances where we actually have been able to act preventively. And it's one of those things that it's a little bit hard to prove what would have happened had we not acted. We don't know, but we can imagine. And so, for example, over a year ago in Sudan, we were on the eve of a referendum for the creation of South Sudan, and it was an extraordinarily fragile situation that threatened to revert back to a civil war that had claimed hundreds of thousands, or by some counts, far more lives. And we engaged very intensely, starting with the president galvanizing the international community to get behind the referendum, to make sure that the parties stood behind it and that they let it go forward. And it did go forward. And as imperfect as the situation is, we have the creation of a new state, South Sudan. We're in a far better place than we were. And again, you can't say what would have happened had we not engaged, but I'd like to think that we acted in a preventive way. Cote d'Ivoire is another example where you had a president who lost an election insisted on hanging on to power, threatened violence, and everything was in place for a significant conflict and significant atrocities. Again, there too, we engaged with international partners. The United Nations and its peacekeeping effort did a very effective job. And as a result, the losing president left the country. He's now in The Hague, and we have a return to democracy. And then, of course, Libya, where Gaddafi was threatening Benghazi, tens of thousands of lives were at risk, and the United States, with other countries, led the effort to prevent what would have been, and I profoundly believe would have been, a horrific slaughter. We marshaled the United Nations. We used our unique military assets to help other countries use theirs. And the result is, as difficult as Libya is today, I believe we prevented a terrible atrocity there as well. But Syria is, I think, for all of us, a tremendous frustration. Let's be clear, though. We haven't done nothing. We've done a lot, but we obviously haven't done enough to change the facts on the ground. When the crisis in Syria began, and in particular, when Assad turned on his own people, we began to play a lead role in trying to bring the international community together to do something about it. And we've taken a number of steps that are not insignificant. We've worked very hard to isolate the Syrian government and the Assad regime, economically and politically. The sanctions that have been applied are starving the regime of money, making it more difficult to buy off those whose support it needs. Isolated politically around the world, with dozens of countries joining a coalition to isolate the Syrian government. At the same time, we've worked very hard to build up the opposition, to make it credible, to give it tools, to make it more effective. It's incredibly slow. It's a difficult work in progress, but it is happening. Just a week ago, Secretary Kerry was in Istanbul and announced a doubling of our assistance to the civilian opposition, and also, for the first time, significant assistance to the military component of the opposition, including non-lethal but nonetheless important items that would support them in combat, things like protective gear, body armor, night vision goggles, and so forth. So we've done that to try to make them more effective. Third, the United States is and remains by far the largest humanitarian donor to Syria in this time of need. As Mike, you said, this crisis internally and externally is reaching extraordinary proportions. By the estimate of the United Nations, about 6.5 million people are in need within Syria. And refugees, including especially in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and to some extent Iraq, not only are facing terrible situations for themselves, but are beginning to have a very difficult impact on the countries that are good enough to host them. But we're working to take a lead role in trying to do something about that. And we're also trying to prepare for the day after Assad, including making sure that the chemical weapons that are all too present in Syria are accounted for and secured, and trying to keep the state together. And finally, where we've been trying to drive this, and we obviously haven't succeeded to date, but let me explain what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. We've been trying to drive this toward a political transition where Assad and the regime give up power, transition it to some kind of authority, and ultimately elections are held and a democratic government takes over. Why is this so important? Because absent that kind of managed transition, it's very likely that the state will fall apart, that its institutions will fall apart, and that the fragmentation results in a failed state that becomes home to extremist groups, in which chemical weapons are floating around and getting into the wrong hands, and in which people are suffering. And so we put a tremendous diplomatic effort in trying to bring people together toward the solution, and obviously we haven't gotten there yet. So that's what we're trying to do. But meanwhile, Michael, as you said, tens of thousands of people have been killed, and now millions of people are in dire need. And it's a very unsatisfying place to be. It's something that preoccupies all of us, that we're working on every single day. I think you asked, why is it so hard? There's another factor. We spent in the United States the last decade plus engaged in 2 wars. And we spent the last 4 years working to get out of those wars. We ended the war in Iraq. We're on a glide path to end the war in Afghanistan. There is, understandably, a profound caution in taking steps that could possibly engage the United States again in another conflict, particularly in that part of the world. And so the President is working on this in a way that is very deliberate, very focused, and my hope is we're able to move Syria to a better place in the coming months. Let me just cite one quick example of where a managed transition of this kind has actually worked better than I think anyone anticipated, and that's in Yemen, where very much what we're trying to do in Syria has actually happened and has made life a lot better. So that's what we're working on. I hope that the next time we get together, we have a better story to tell.
All right, we have a few minutes left, so we could spend the whole time talking about Syria, but I do want to say there are also, parts of the world, and I'm thinking particularly in large parts of Sudan, as well as the eastern part of Congo, that don't really get the headlines or the attention from my former colleagues. And, in Darfur, for instance, there was, we think several 100,000 people died in an ethnic cleansing campaign that was characterized by the museum and others as genocide 10 years ago. So what can be done about these situations that don't really get the kind of attention from the press, from the public, from policymakers? As you pointed out, the American public is war-weary, and that's factoring in. That's doubly true of a place like Sudan or Eastern Congo, where arguably, millions of people are at risk in those places.
I think one of the frustrations, especially for advocates, is that you go through a period where a particular issue, a particular crisis, suddenly catches on in the public consciousness, in large part because of the work that institutions like yours do, advocacy groups, and Darfur is a very good example of that. I think we can all remember not so very long ago when Darfur was on the front pages of our papers, where it was featured prominently in presidential campaigns and debates, and now that's no longer the case. Attention moves on. Focus moves on. The only slightly reassuring thing I can say is that government actually doesn't move on. We continue to work on the panoply of problems in Sudan and in South Sudan in an intensive way virtually every day. As I mentioned a little while ago, we put a tremendous effort into making sure the referendum that led to the creation of South Sudan took place. And I believe that had that not happened, we would have seen a return to a North-South civil war that would have claimed many, many more lives. As we speak, we're engaged in Darfur, engaged both with the government in Sudan and with rebel groups, working on both to try and come to a more lasting peace process. We're engaged in other parts of the country, whether it's Blue Nile, South Kordofan, Abyei, to try and move the parties to a better place. And we're going to name, hopefully very soon, a new envoy for Sudan to pick up on the extraordinary work that some of you may know him, Princeton Lyman, recently did. So I think what happens is, and again, it's frustrating, but a lot of this moves out of the spotlight. It moves out of the headlines, but it doesn't move out of the work of government. And many of these problems have an intractable quality to them. We've seen a few things that are probably a little premature to talk about in public that suggest that there may be some more positive openings in Sudan in the days and weeks and months ahead, but we'll see if that develops.
Okay, I would like to ask one more question. We're sadly sort of out of time, but I just want to delve a little bit deeper into an issue that you touched on in your opening remarks, which is about accountability. This is obviously a very important issue to our museum. We have an extensive discussion in our permanent exhibition and elsewhere about Nuremberg. When you think about Nuremberg, it's kind of incredible that the Nazi High Command was basically charged, tried, and the sentence carried out within a year. And now we have situations, like in Cambodia, where the perpetrators of the Khmer Rouge, the trials last for years and years and years. Can you just tell us briefly a little bit more about the Obama administration's approach to these accountability issues, what you're trying to push, and also just candidly your thoughts about the International Criminal Court, which has been something that the American public community has been somewhat ambivalent about?
It's pretty simple. Accountability is an imperative. It's an imperative for two reasons. One, it's a moral imperative. But beyond that, it is actually a strategic imperative in the way we look at these problems. And here's why. One of the biggest drivers of atrocities is impunity. If someone believes they can get away with it, they'll try to get away with it. And one of the best checks against that is accountability. And that's why it's so important that we try to set that standard, international institutions try and set that standard, other countries try and set that standard. And we've been working on that. Let me give you a few examples. First, and maybe most important, with regard to the International Criminal Court, we find ourselves more and more in alignment with the court in a number of areas, and we've taken steps to demonstrate that. We voted for, I guess just a short while ago, a referral of Libya to the International Criminal Court, which is the first time we'd done so at the United Nations. The Security Council referred the matter to the Criminal Court. We got behind that. We have been urging countries around the world not to support or cooperate with those who are indictees of the court so that it could be more effective in doing its business. Recently, in Kigali, we had the surrender of a leading rebel and indictee of the court to our embassy, and we worked with the court to hand him over. We're not at the point where we're changing our decision about joining for two reasons. And I know this is frustrating to a lot of people. One, we have to look out for our men and women in uniform. For better or worse, they play often a unique role around the world, and protecting them is something that's a priority for us. But second, we believe that we have the institutions at home to do the work that, in terms of accountability, and including our own accountability, that other countries don't have. But as I said, increasingly, we find ourselves in alignment with the work of the court, and my belief is, as we go forward, we'll see more and more of that. But it really comes back to the first principle, which is absent accountability, absent that imperative, you're not only doing a moral injustice, you're doing a practical injustice to your ability to actually stop atrocities.
Tony, I wish we could talk for another hour, because it's been fascinating, but it's been a great conversation, and I think what it really focuses on is the fact that we have a lot of work to do. One has to be honest about one's failures, but I agree with you. I think there's been progress over the last 20 years, and I think we have a lot of work to do at the museum and also in broader society and the government to do a better job in the future. Most of all, I really wanted to express my appreciation on behalf of the museum. You're a busy person, and it means a lot to us that you came here to talk about these issues. I'd like everyone to give Tony Blinken a round of applause, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.